But you want to take it out freedom of speech. And then I'm spending this.
Young jumper. MDC
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the press conference of the MDC Alliance on land reform policy or position. The conference is going to be addressed by none other than Advocate Mahere, the National Secretary for Communications or National Spokesperson of the MDC Alliance. Over to you, Madam Mahere.
Oh, thank you very much. Esteemed members of the press, thank you very much. The MDC Alliance acknowledges the land reform program as a necessary correction of colonial injustices. We noted that the approach used to correct and address historical imbalances was not the most desirable, as evidence over the past 20 years demonstrates. We are importing food when we used to feed other nations. 8.6 million of our population are food insecure, notwithstanding over $6 billion reportedly invested in command agriculture in the last 3 years. We know with concern that the global compensation deed has been concluded without the participation of Parliament and key stakeholders in breach of the Constitution and the rule of law. In particular, Section 295, subsection 4, which requires that any compensation for previously acquired agricultural land must be assessed and paid in terms of an act of Parliament. An arbitrary figure of $3.5 billion has been agreed to by the state as being a global figure that will be paid as compensation. However, of great concern to us as the MDC Alliance is that there is no clarity as to where these funds will come from, who the exact beneficiaries of these funds are, or how this figure has been computed. The lack of transparency on a matter that concerns public debt and the public interest does not bode well. The MDC Alliance restates that the land reform program is irreversible. However, there is need to rationalize the process through a comprehensive land audit that ensures title and security of tenure to the citizens who are beneficiaries. The MDC has always emphasized the need to bring finality to Zimbabwe's land question through a national and inclusive process aimed at a sustainable, equitable, transparent, just, lawful, and economically efficient rationalization of the ownership and use of land. Adequate and fair compensation is necessary to ensure viability and national stability. Section 295, subsection 4 of the Constitution expressly requires that the compensation payable must be assessed and paid in terms of an Act of Parliament. And as a Social Democratic Party, we emphasize that the measures in the land policy must include labor, the labor that was affected by the land reform program, the 4 million former commercial farm workers and 150,000 seasonal farm workers that have been totally ignored in the correctional phase of the land reform program must be prioritized and they must be compensated. We call for urgent attention to be given to their plight and for their concerns to also be taken into account. Members of the press, property rights are sacrosanct, and security of investment must be upheld. Property rights, including those contained in international agreements, are inviolable and cannot be compromised. Now, we accept that it is necessary to remedy the gaps that arose on account of the land reform program and the national interest to ensure that we return to agricultural productivity and a sustainable and inclusive system of land tenure. However, it's our firm view that mishandling the correctional phase of the land reform program through a lack of transparency, through inadequate consultation, and through illegality may create new problems that will haunt us in the future and impede the very objectives of agricultural productivity and sustainability that we collectively aim for. As the MDC Alliance, we continuously emphasize that the rule of law must be upheld. There must be wide consultation of all stakeholders to ensure that there is closure to this important national issue. It's important that we outline what we, as the alternative, propose that we would do as a new administration under an MDC Alliance government. First and foremost, we would bring finality to the land question. At present, people are still fighting over land invasions, double plot allocations, and boundary disputes. This must all be resolved. There's a need to deal with the question of security of tenure. Beneficiaries of the land reform program need to be given title so that land owners will have both land use value and exchange value so that they can access credit lines. There is a need to preserve the sanctity of BIPA and BIT agreements. There's a need to ensure finance agriculture infrastructure. In order to fully empower newly resettled farmers and land reform beneficiaries, there's a need for seasonal capital and land loans to be provided by commercial banks, as well as the Rural Development Fund. There's a need to set up an impartial, independent, well-resourced, professional agency, the Land Commission, which is provided for under Section 296 of the Constitution, to carry out the constitutional functions that are set out there. There's a need to restore collateral security in land, to facilitate the sustainable funding of the agricultural sector, consistent with the Constitution of Zimbabwe. There's a need to deracialize land ownership in order to improve farm production and agricultural productivity. Agricultural productivity is not a race issue. It's a product of training, investment in farming, and correct modern infrastructure supported by adequate funding. Good international relations are good for export and good for farming as a business. We state and restate that there's need for a comprehensive and transparent land audit to eliminate multiple farm ownerships and promote productive land utilization. There's need to introduce a land tax. An MDC Alliance government will introduce an appropriate land occupation and use tax that encourages production on titled land and facilitates production of off-farm infrastructure by the state. An MDC Alliance government will promote and facilitate the uptake of new technology, something we expound upon in great detail in our smart agricultural policy set out in the Smart Manifesto. This is necessary for the agricultural sector, from farm level to agro-industries. This will also include supporting the use of sustainable energy sources, such as solar energy in the agricultural sector and electronic land management systems that publish information on land ownership, production services, and ecological location. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I wanted to find out the issue of compensation. The compensation issue that has been raised by the government is an engagement between the government and the former white farmers. As a party, have you also reached out to the farmers to understand their position in regards to this issue of compensation, so that maybe you can also speak from your position as a party on how you have managed to engage the former white farmers who are about to be compensated?
Thank you very much. Absolutely. The first point to note with the, I believe you're referring to the Global Compensation Agreement, the Global Compensation Deed. That effort to reach out to the farmers by the government, as I've highlighted, is completely unconstitutional. In terms of Section 295, subsection 4 of the Constitution, there cannot be a methodology, evaluation methodology, outside the province of an act of parliament. This secret process that's taken place is not only unilateral, but it's unconstitutional. So as a party, we emphasize the need to adhere to the rule of law. If we've learned anything from the last 20 years, is that if we don't comply with the rule of law, there will be consequences that will continue to haunt us in the future. So we reiterate the need to continuously adhere to legal provisions. And why is it important to comply with this requirement of the need to go to an act of parliament? It has to be clear to all Zimbabweans what this compensation framework is. It cannot be a secret deal with a few farmers and the government. I'm sure you've already heard that a number of citizens are already questioning that this 3.5 billion, how has it been computed? Am I, as a taxpayer, going to be saddled with the burden of this? Already we know that in terms of the Constitution, you cannot saddle the government with such a heavy loan bill, with such a heavy debt burden, without placing it before Parliament. How is it going to be paid? Are we going to wake up one day with another Debt Assumption Act? It can't be shrouded in mystery. So the unconstitutionality of that process has to be emphasized, number one. Coming to the second aspect of your question, have we reached out to other stakeholders? The farmers? Absolutely yes. You'll be aware that our Secretary for Lands and Agriculture is Mr. Rusty Markham. It's unfortunate he's supposed to be here, but he's currently locked up in quarantine in the United Kingdom. He's done extensive work on behalf of his portfolio, reaching out to farmers, speaking to a number of farmers who've been dispossessed and collating their views. And it's important to point out that you don't only look at one stakeholder group. You look at the farm workers as well. You speak to them as well. You don't, because there are a number of interest groups that are affected by this process. The land reform program did not only affect the farmers themselves, it also affected the farm workers. I've already given you figures, 4 million. That's a huge constituency, and their interests have to be prioritized and looked into. So as we're in that correctional phase of the land reform program, we emphasize that the farm workers must not be left behind. You can't speak of giving 3.5 billion to one constituency and you leave behind the persons who are tilling the land. That's why we say that this process that ZANU-PF is embarking upon, that's shrouded in mystery, is completely wrong for that reason. It leaves out an important constituency, the farm workers. And it's unacceptable for that reason. So not only have we engaged the farmers, but we've also engaged the farm workers, who for us are a critical constituency, as I've highlighted in my press statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Your name and media house?
My name is Jim Tangwis. I'm from 26 Richard. Maybe just as a follow-up to what Gibson is saying. You said that you engaged the farmers. What did the farmers say? Are you at liberty to share with us some of the farmers that you engage with, and also maybe the concerns that are being raised by farm workers? And then you mentioned in your presentation that there has to be a land audit, if I can get you, right? The government has set aside a land audit commission. I don't know if you're aware about that. It has been trying to do some findings, trying to cut down or resize some big farmers. What's your take on the findings that the government has come up with?
Okay, so I want to deal with the farm workers, first of all. The biggest lament on the part of the farm workers is that we've been ignored. And that's why I continuously go back to that point. That even when the government sits down and says compensation, 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 even when you're coming up with your legal frameworks, your constitutions, when you're speaking about compensation and fixing the land reform program, the biggest lament by the farm workers is that not enough is being done to deal with the concerns of farm workers. Even when the redistribution is being done by the Minister of Lands, one of the foremost beneficiary groups should have been the farm workers because they know how to till the land, and yet they were completely excluded. The people who are the foremost of the list or at the top of the list were elites who don't know sometimes how to till the land. So those are some of the concerns that are raised by the farm workers, and it's no small number. 4 million is a massive constituency, and that does not include seasonal workers. Seasonal workers now bring the number up by at least 150,000. Those are some of the concerns that are being raised. And when it comes to other farmers, I think the big issue is around title. You know, and the lack of respect for property rights, and the flip-flopping on the part of the government. The continued land invasions that are taking place that I've already made reference to. The lack of adherence to the rule of law, the politicization of the land reform program. That if you fall out of favor with a politician, you're kicked off a farm. Those are some of the laments, and that agricultural productivity is never at the forefront of the land reform process. And the piecemeal approach to reform. What we would have expected, and this is part of the lament as well, is a national inclusive process to dealing with this issue once and for all. You can't pick a small aspect and say, the tiny aspect of compensation, we're going to have a secret meeting about compensation. This has to be a national inclusive process that includes parliaments, that includes a number of stakeholders, and that hasn't been done. And so that's what some of our key constituents are talking about. And like I emphasized, the issue of the farm workers. And then the second part of your question.
The land audit?
The land audits, let's be absolutely clear. No audit has taken place. The number one sign that an audit is successful is transparency. Number one, we have not heard from the state the outcome of any land audit process. We have not heard from them who owns what land. We would have expected to hear, if it was a genuine, sincere land audit, we would have expected to hear, it should be clear who owns what land. What size of land does who own? How many farms do they own? That's what we expect to hear from a land audit. That's why I've stated in my press conference, in my press statement, we don't just want an audit for the sake of it. It has to be comprehensive. It has to be transparent. And we haven't had that as yet. I think it would not be correct, it would not be sincere to say that we've had a comprehensive, transparent land audit. We haven't. We want to know who owns what number of farms. How productive are they being? If you drive around Zimbabwe today, we see all sorts of farms that are lying bare. Who is holding these farms? Why aren't they producing on them? We always hear about downsizing. Whose farms are being downsized? We want to know who. The young. Access to land for young people. We want to know why aren't young people being able to access land? All those issues are important. The politicization of land. Again, it shouldn't be a political issue. I should not have to pull out a ZANU-PF card to access land. It shouldn't matter that you don't have a political affiliation or that you're MDC. It shouldn't matter. And just to use a wild example, Godfrey Kurawone should be able, if he's interested in land, to be able to apply. It shouldn't matter. We shouldn't politicize this issue. That's why I'm saying the process should be national. It should be inclusive. It should be comprehensive. I hope that takes care of your intervention. I think we need to give others a chance. Thank you.
This side, your name and media house, please.
Thank you, Takuchi Ambakwe from MDC TV. My first question is regarding the fact you stated that there is no act to implement everything that's been happening.
Absolutely.
Minister Ziyambi, let me just clarify that. Minister Ziyambi is saying that whatever that has been done in the past few weeks is done in line with the Lands Act. So I need you to give me a response if the Lands Act does not speak to that. Number one. Number two,
let me deal with that so that I don't forget your questions, sir, from Zimbabwe, because there's no such piece of legislation called the Lands Act. Okay, there's a Land Acquisition Act, but that's not the piece of legislation envisaged under Section 295, subsection 4 of the Constitution. What Section 295, subsection 4 talks about is how the method, how compensation must be paid to three categories of farmers: indigenous farmers, BIPA farmers, and former commercial farmers. And it specifically says under that's subsections 1, 2, and 3. Subsection 4 then goes on to say that there must be an act of parliament that states the methodology of how that compensation must be paid and assessed. To date, Parliament has not sat. I challenge Mr. Ziyambi to produce which act he's talking about. The Lands Act doesn't exist as a piece of legislation. I'm just letting you know now.
all right,
The Land Commission Act doesn't cover it, if that's the one that he's talking about. The Land Acquisition Act doesn't talk about compensation at all. So I don't know which Lands Act he's talking about.
Right.
There's no act of parliament, no statute that's been passed. And if he's referring to SI 62 of 2020, that's not an act of parliament. You can't set out a question of compensation that the Constitution specifically states should be dealt with in an act of parliament, which is not delegated legislation. You cannot say that you've then complied with Section 295, subsection 4. The legislature and the Constitution were clear that it has to be in the form of an act of parliament.
all right, thank you for that. And the second bit of my question goes to the issue of compensating the farm workers. You highlighted that they've been left out of the whole equation. We're talking about the farmers only. But the Constitution does not cover them. And isn't that an issue that was missed at the 2013 compilation of the Constitution? Just give us.
For us, it's a moral issue. I didn't come here to give you a lecture on the law. I came here to give you the policy position of the party. And the policy position of the party is that it's immoral to leave out an important constituency such as farm workers, 4 million in number, who worked on these farms, and say that they should get no compensation. They were violently removed from these farms, and to completely ignore them when you're correcting what is now accepted by ZANU-PF as being an error. So I think it's completely incorrect to go legalistic on this and say that they must be ignored. They are a key constituency that has to be taken into account. They applied. That's why I said the whole entire matrix has to be conclusive. It has to be inclusive. You cannot ignore the plight of these workers if you are genuinely aiming to correct what went wrong in the land reform program. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Lucy Yasini. I'm a freelance journalist. You made reference to a number of grey areas. You raised a number of grey areas that have been raised by this government in addressing the land issue. and you have reached out to farm workers and the commercial farmers, the other farmers. But have you made any effort to reach out to government and raise those issues?
Well, absolutely, and the key platform that we use to do that is Parliament. Just yesterday, Honourable Tendai Biti was raising these very issues that I'm talking about right now in Parliament. He was talking about the lack of constitutionality, about the Global Compensation Agreement. He was talking about the U-turn, the unconstitutionality of SI 62 of 2020. So absolutely yes, and in the very forum that's designed for that. So these policy questions are being debated and raised as questions in the forum that's designed for that, and that is in Parliament. So yes, ma'am, we are.
Let's have the last one.
Constitution yedu ya 2013 yakaitwa nemapato ose. Saka apa kusanaka kwayo kutadziswa neZANU-PF here nekuti kututsira mubvunzo wanga uchitaurwa naTaku wevashandi, ma-negotiators ku-constitution aibvawo kubato re-MDC kuine mapato akasiyana-siyanawo nevanhu. Saka kuzonzi zvakuitwa neZANU kana kuti zviri mu-constitution izvi kukanganisika kwekuti iZANU-PF here kana kuti kukanganisika kwekuti kubva pakutanga process yacho yakanga itori flawed.
Thank you. That's a very good question. And if you'll allow me to respond in English, because some of the issues I'm going to raise actually demand some legalese. Now, it's funny that you should say that the Constitution is tying ZANU-PF's hands so they cannot look into the plight of farm workers. If you look at the joint statement that was issued by the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Lands, it included certain clauses and certain things that they had agreed that aren't provided for in the Constitution. I'll give you an example. They said that they were going to restore title to BIPA farmers, something that's not provided for in the Constitution, and they would restore title and revoke offer letters that were already granted to beneficiaries. Now, if you look at Section 295 of the Constitution, that is not a competent manner to compensate BIPA landholders. It's simply not provided for. So it's funny that you should say that ZANU-PF is willing to break the Constitution for BIPA farmers and twist the Constitution. And yet when we raise the plight of farm workers, they say, oh no, it's not constitutionally provided for. To do so is to hide behind a finger. If we are to resolve the land question to finality, we have to do it in a manner that's inclusive. We have to accept that key constituencies were left out. We cannot hide behind the fact that, oh no, Section 295 doesn't include farm workers. We have to re-look at it. If we're prepared to do 27 amendments to the Constitution to give the executive, to give the president more power, then we should be willing to sit down and say, no, we need to re-look at the plight of farm workers if the issue is just that it's not constitutionally provided for. But the bottom line is that as a policy issue, the plight of farm workers must be revisited. That's something that's come out time and time again in our consultation. So you cannot hide behind a finger and say, no, it's not provided for. The plight of farm workers has to be taken into account. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Leo Mnene from newzimbabwe.com. My first question is a matter of clarity. Maybe if you can tell us what the farm workers you said you talked to, or your party talked to some of the farm workers, what they say they lost when those farms were taken or repossessed, and then secondly.
In fact, let me just deal with that straight away. Their homes, their livelihoods. Some of them had been on their farms or on those farms for 5 generations. I think we all remember the setup that was on the farms. Some of them had been living and working on those farms for generations and generations and generations. They were living and working in their homes for years and years and years. So they lost their entire livelihoods and they had nowhere to go. So they lost absolutely everything. What's your next question?
And then my next question was, we were with war veterans yesterday here. it's in line with your statement that land should not be treated racially. So war veterans told us that they were very disappointed. They are very disappointed that the same people they fought against to reclaim their land are now being given back this land. I would like to know the party's position on that, and also what you would do differently to all this setup.
So I think the critical issue is this, that those who have benefited from the land so far should get title. So there should be no reversal, so to speak, of the land reform program. So it's not a question of saying, oh, you had been given your land, we're taking your land back and we're reinstating the farmer that was there. I think that when anyone speaks of reversal, that's the aspect of ZANU-PF's policy that everybody is challenging. And there is a clip where Honorable Tendai Biti explains that in great detail when he was in Parliament yesterday. That is the aspect where we say ZANU-PF is reversing the land reform program. That's what we're talking about. That someone has an offer letter, they were allocated a piece of land. Now you want to revert that offer letter and say the farmer that used to be there is now the one who is now there. That's the issue, I think, that is contentious. What would we do differently? Like I said, the starting point is a comprehensive audit. You cannot start talking about allocations when you haven't done an audit. Audit is step number one. Having done the audit now, then you start talking about giving title in a rationalized manner. Having an inclusive, participatory, sustainable process of allocating land that is then in accordance with right principles. That's what we emphasize. And if you look at our smart policy, I've picked up aspects of it in my statement. That's what we emphasize. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've come to the end of our press conference.
Thank you. Okay, today.